Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you to the American Enterprise Institute for today's conversation, For the Least of These, a Biblical Answer to Poverty. On behalf of the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, which is a co-sponsor of today's event and our Values and Capitalism project here at AEI, it's an honor to meet to welcome you here. And we're here, obviously, to talk about one primary subject, to talk about poverty, and to do so in a different kind of light than normal, in a different way than we typically do here in the nation's capital. As my boss, Arthur Brooks, puts it in a two-page foreword in the chapter that you have, in the book that you have in front of you, this handsome, brand new book from IFWE, which we are grateful for bringing as gifts for all of us who are in the room today. As Arthur puts it in this foreword, that the Christian Gospels make it abundantly clear that Jesus calls on us to care for the poor. What is not at all clear, however, is the best means to do that. The best means by which Christians in a modern industrial society, particularly one in which the state has built a large technocratic edifice ostensibly devoted to solving the problems of poverty, can and should carry out this directive from our Lord. So this hot-off-the-press book from IFWE is about precisely that question. As you know, four of its authors, who have four different kinds of chapters in the book, are gathered before us today, and it's a privilege to welcome Art Lindsley, Ann Bradley, Peter Greer, and Jay Richards. So speaking from left to right today, although actually I think we'll have Ann first and then Peter second. Oh, we will? Well, we're co-sponsoring, so maybe let's do it that way. We'll have Art, and then Ann, and then Peter, and then Jay, speaking from your left to right. We will have a window into each chapter. Obviously not going to get into the fullness of their chapter. We're going to try hard to stay within a tight timetable, 10 minutes per author, and then we'll throw it open to you for a robust conversation. First, a few quick announcements. Really want to thank Kristen Brown and Hugh Welchel from the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics for your co-sponsorship today. And obviously also our team, Meredith Schultz and Tyler Castle, both brand new hires at AEI and our Values and Capitalism project, who are just doing a terrific job. We do have a few other announcements, a couple of upcoming events to flag for you. One on May 8th up in New York, Arthur Brooks and Eric Metaxas will be speaking together about happiness, and Greg Thornberry of the King's College will be moderating that conversation. That'll be available via live stream the evening of May 8th, so look for an email on that from us soon. Also, very pleased to announce, just as of this week, that Gary Haugen and Tom Hart, Gary of the International Justice Mission and Tom Hart of the One Campaign, will be gathering in this room along with Nick Eberstadt, one of our AI scholars, to talk about violence and about the connection between the rule of law and ending poverty, particularly abroad. That will be on May the 28th, so stay tuned for an email about that as well. Whether you join us in person or perhaps via live stream, we'd love to welcome you into that conversation. Finally, I want to remind all of us that in addition to those of us who are in the room, we have a number of classes from around the country, students from different Christian colleges who are joining us, and I think we'll have at least one or two questions from them. I know Travis Ricketts at Bryan College, in his Origins and Basis of Government class, the whole student group is with us today as well, so welcome to you if you're joining us via live stream. Clearly, Christian college students today care deeply about the poor, and we're going to hear a little bit more about how we can think differently about ending poverty in our own generation from these four speakers. So first, we'll do it your way. Art Lindsley will be speaking with us, opening things off. He serves as the Vice President of Theological Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. A number of us here in town know Art from his work with the C.S. Lewis Institute, his work as a longtime discipleship expert and pastor. He worked with the Ligonier Valley Study Center for some time, has written C.S. Lewis's Case for Christ, True Truth, Love, the Ultimate Apologetic, and Classical Apologetics. He's a longtime friend of the project. So for those of us in the room who are pastors, and I know that there are several, of you, because I've seen the list, and it's a great list. So for those of us who are pastors and joining us with theological point of view in mind, looking forward to Art's remarks. Next will be Ann Bradley, who is Vice President for Economic Initiatives at IFWE. You have her full bio there in front of you, so I won't read everything. She's taught previously at Charles University in Prague. She's taught at the Buchanan Center at GMU, the program for economics, politics, and law. She's a longtime friend of the project, and last year, when we gathered 100 students and professors together, she joined us via phone from the delivery room the same day that she had given birth to a newborn. Unbelievable. So tenacity, Ann Bradley. Peter Greer, I'm not kidding. I asked her to tell you about that story. Peter Greer joins us today from Lancaster County. He is president and CEO of Hope International. A number of us know his work well. He has a degree from Messiah College, a degree from Harvard. Since he joined Hope in 2004, I happen to know that they have reached not just the 2 countries that they were in at the time, but now 17 different countries. Peter has spoken with our faculty group a number of times and is a wonderful friend. He is co-authoring with his colleague, Chris Horst, a new book for AEI called Entrepreneurship for Human Flourishing, and I suspect we'll hear a little window into that as well today. He's written a number of books, The Poor Will Be Glad, The Spiritual Danger of Doing Good, Mission Drift, and obviously this forthcoming monograph. Finally, Jay Richards is well known to a number of us, especially at AEI. He's had a stint here. He's had a stint with the Heritage Foundation. He's taught at Biola. He's currently a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute, and has a voice that is really unique in this particular area of the intersection between faith and economics. He has a wonderful book that he co-authored called Indivisible that really gets at the connection between cultural and religious liberty on the one hand and economic liberty, and I would commend that to you, Indivisible, from 2012. He's written a number of others, including some bestsellers, Money, Greed, and God from Harper One, the book Infiltrated that he did an event here at AEI on quite recently. It's a real pleasure to have Jay Richards with us. So with that, we turn to Art Lindsley to kick things off. We'll hear from each author for about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn things over to you for a conversation. Art, welcome to AEI.
Well, the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, again, we call ourselves IFWE, so hopefully that makes it easier to remember. My job here is to give a quick introduction to Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics and to why this book, and then also sketch very quickly my chapter. I'm going to have to make it very much a sketch because I know even the part on Jubilee I'm going to get to took me at least 45 minutes or to an hour to give as a talk, so all I'm going to be able to do is hit the highlights and hopefully stimulate you to be able to ask questions. Well, the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, as you can see from our this slide, we have 3 main things that we're committed to: freedom, fulfillment, and flourishing. Our message statement is essentially this: if we, as a research organization dedicated to advancing biblical and economic principles that help individuals find fulfillment in their work and contribute to a free and flourishing society. We've been in existence for about 2.5 to 3 years right now, and we've focused on what can be called a biblical advocacy think tank that really addresses, from a biblical point of view, issues related to work and issues related to economics. What we've found is that many theologians don't know economics, and many economists don't know theology. I'm coming at it from more of a theological perspective, and I've learned a ton in the last 2.5 years, but I realize how much more I have to learn. And so it's really getting people together. Initially, we started out with having colloquiums with top-level theologians and top-level economists talking to each other, and it was a fascinating discussion to understand, where people are coming from in terms of their understanding. Well, this particular book, for the least of these, we sat down and decided what issue do we want to most address from a biblical point of view and an economic point of view. And we thought poverty is obvious because the Bible addresses it so often within the scriptures. And there are many different opinions on, as Josh said, on really how to address this issue of poverty. I think we would all agree that there's a place for government, a place for the church, a place for nonprofits, but there's also a place for markets. And I think increasingly there's been a great understanding from people at all different points in the spectrum that markets play an important role. In fact, one author points out that in 1800, about 85% of people were in extreme poverty, which put in terms of the contemporary definition is $1.25 a year or less. In 1950, 50% were in extreme poverty. In 1992, 25%. In 2007, 15%. Recently, the head of the World Bank, Kim, I think it is, said that he thinks it's realistic to be able to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. So it's really interesting to look at those articles. And he puts a real accent on the place of markets in doing so. In any case, for the least of these is trying to address this issue. We've got three major parts, and if you have the book in front of you, I suppose you can see this. First is the biblical perspective on the poor. We have some outstanding writers, Glenn Sunshine, who's an intellectual historian, Walter Kaiser, who is in many ways the dean of Old Testament scholars, was the president of Gordon Conwell Seminary, writes a chapter. We have David Cotter, who's a rising star, an economist and a theologian, who's getting his PhD in New Testament. And so he's got an excellent chapter there on the New Testament view of the poor. We have a section on from a more economic perspective, although we desired that always the biblical framework be there, but we have some economists that are really addressing it in the second section. Anne has a great paper that she'll talk about. We have Lord Brian Griffiths from United Kingdom, who is a chief advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and then also now vice chairman of Goldman Sachs Europe. He's a really outstanding thinker, outstanding writer. So it was a real honor to get him to be involved with us. And then we have the third section is poverty alleviation in practice. And we have people like Father Sirico, the head of Acton University, Larry Reed, who's the head of FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. Marvin Olasky, who's the head of World Magazine. Of course, Peter Greer, who's here, and Jay Richards. We're glad to have them involved with us as well. Our main purpose is here to not only critique some of the inadequate understandings, but essentially point out a positive perspective. We think that helping the poor is something that we're called to as believers, not only because the Bible commands it, and that's to be true, but because we believe people are made in the image of God, and they have worth and value and dignity. And we want each person who's poor not only to survive, but to thrive and to have a fullness of life. And that's our goal, to be able to point out some directions that can be helpful in doing that. Well, my chapter in there is that does God require the state to redistribute wealth? And I don't know how much time I have. How much time do I have now here according to your official? 4 minutes, okay. That's all right. Really, all I can do here is mention very quickly the outline I have. I have 5 myths about Jubilee. I'll mention them, and hopefully they're provocative enough that you can desire to ask questions with me about it. First of all, one myth is that Jubilee means forgiveness of debt. I don't believe that it does. It's essentially, it's not forgiveness of debt as we normally use the term. It's essentially a debt paid. It's more like a mortgage burning party that when you paid off your debt, then you celebrate with friends. But essentially, that's what Jubilee involves. And it's been a great misunderstanding on the part of many. Second, that Jubilee involves a redistribution of wealth and land. It doesn't involve a redistribution of wealth because it's essentially a lease, and it stays in the same hands all the time. So there's no redistribution because it never technically left the hands of the original people that owned the land in the first place. The other 3 are the Jubilee myths that Jubilee involve a relativization or relative nature of private property. And essentially, it reinforces the place of private property rather than undermine it. We can talk about that later. The Jubilee leads to income equality. It really doesn't. People could make money off of the lease, and they could make as much money as they could off of the crops that they got each year. Plus, they could buy unlimited houses in walled cities and retain those houses. There was no redistribution of wealth in that sense. And that Jubilee is a universally applicable principle. There may be some principles or types in the idea of Jubilee that I think are carried through into the New Testament. But essentially, Jubilee did not apply to the poorest of the poor in the land, that those who were foreigners or strangers. So many people have used the idea of Jubilee, but really not paid attention to the biblical context to it. And then there are 5 points with regard to Acts. First of all, that the early believers did not sell all their possessions, that the early Christian sharing was voluntary and not state mandated. It was not a permanent practice, but a temporary measure. It was particularly around the time of Pentecost, where there were many people staying in Jerusalem that had become new believers. And you can't get aught out of that you can't use a narrative passage as a norm for theological understanding. And if you do, at least ought to teach what you say that it teaches, if it teaches socialism. You ought to interpret the narrative by the didactic. That's a theological principle, that you ought to interpret narrative passages by clear teaching passages of Scripture. All right, that's what I'm just putting forward. Hopefully, there'll be some time that we can have questions later. But I would say just because the Bible doesn't require the state to redistribute wealth doesn't mean the state can't do so. We have considerations on our website and on an upcoming book on that particular issue of the role of the state in addressing these kinds of issues. We have several papers on limited government. However, the Bible does command us to help the least of these, and these commands are addressed to the church and not to the secular, impersonal state. The Bible calls for us to care for the least of these with our time and treasure. So those are my quick comments. Hopefully we can have more discussion later.
Okay, what I want to talk about, and my chapter in the book deals with the idea of how we think as Christians, first biblically, about this issue of income inequality. The idea of income inequality has been around and been popularized in the past few years, and my suspicion is it's not going away. And so my chapter is an attempt to take biblical principles with good, sound economic thinking to a policy issue at hand. Can the combination of a biblical worldview plus sound economic principles help us get to a better state of the world? And to really understand whether income inequality is a problem and how much of a problem it might be, we have to really go through the mechanics of how it's measured, what it looks like. I also have 10 minutes, so I won't be able to do all of that, but my goal today is to give a very high-level kind of view of my chapter. And I think the first thing is that there's lots of misunderstanding around this topic. First of all, income inequality as it's measured and as it's researched is a complex thing. There's a lot of differences in how we measure it, and so there's a lot of just technical problems from the get-go. And I think if we're just watching the news and viewing the kind of soundbite information that we tend to consume in a fast-paced digital world, we might miss, with very good intentions, how to really help people. And so this idea of whether increasing income inequality is a harbinger of poverty. Does increasing in income inequality suggest to us that the world is becoming a worse place for the poor and for everyone else, for that matter? And this has really manifested itself in lots of social and cultural unrest recently. The Occupy movement is one in particular, where we have seen a rising up and an outcry against this idea that there's the top 1% and then there's everybody else. And so to have a real conversation about this, we have to understand, how do we earn income? What is that process like? And that's where good, sound economic thinking can really take us a long way. income, when it's earned through voluntary exchange, through value creation, literally is a reward for service to others. Now, that's not perfect, and nor are markets. I don't think we do ourselves any favors if we make that claim. But what we know is that markets have a track record, again, through voluntary exchange. So reframing the narrative as one that's exploitative to one that's the voluntary service of others is important. And so, again, this is an empirical question we have to address. Is the increasing income inequality as we measure it in this country a result of exploitation? Or is income inequality, could income inequality be the natural result of a vibrant free market society? Most people, when they come to the topic, are already emotionally charged around it being a bad thing. So what my chapter is an attempt to do is to say, what if we've been thinking about it all wrong? And what if we look at the scripture first in terms of our call through the cultural mandate, what we're supposed to do with our gifts and talents, and the result of that in a market economy? If that's not exploitation, then we might have to take a different stance about income inequality generally. And so for Christians, this has to be framed in the context of this bigger idea of flourishing. What is it that God wants for us here? What is it that we were created to do? And so in the chapter, I have more time to go into greater detail about that. But I particularly find that this is helpful for students to think about the uniqueness of each and every one of us, that there has never been another person on the face of humanity that possesses the exact skills, talents, and gifts that you do. So even if you have a job like a software engineer or a barista or a teacher or working at a think tank, any of those things, even though there's many jobs like that, you bring something special and unique to it that only you can do. And so this is a very liberating idea. And it's not coincidental, I would say, as an economist, that it has everything to do with the notion of comparative advantage, that when we are freed from having to do everything ourselves, we can do and consume and have so much more. So just a little thought exercise. If you think about all the things that you do and rely on every day before you just leave your house, right? So you take a shower, you get dressed, you eat, you get your kids out the door. You had almost nothing to do with any of those things that you rely on. And isn't that a beautiful thing? Because if I had to make my own clothes or make my own toothpaste, I'd probably never leave the house. So this idea of interdependency that markets unleash through voluntary exchange really makes all of us rich. So that's the framework that I'm coming from. The slide that you see here is a demarcation of income inequality over time in the United States, as measured by the Gini coefficient. We won't go into a lot of details there, but basically the Gini is on a scale of 0 to 1. 1 means that one person has all the income and everybody else has nothing. So that's clearly a bad state of affairs, because the person who has everything is sitting pretty and the rest of us are in trouble. A Gini of 0 means everybody has the same income. So imagine a $50,000 income endowment. That's also not ideal, although it might not be as obvious to people why not. But again, if we go back to biblical principles, we can understand why. Because imagine if each of us in this room got a $50,000 endowment tomorrow. We would all use that in very different ways. Some people would make investments that are long-term. Some people would make investments that are short-term, and those would all have different rates of return. And the beauty in that is that we're each created to do and see and use those opportunities differently. And again, this interdependency is what really makes us rich. But if you look at the graph, it shows that income inequality as measured by the Gini is on the uptick. I would say here, without being able to get into a lot of the technical details, that income inequality may tell us something, but my suspicion is that it doesn't tell us everything. For example, in the United States right now, it's about 0.457. But in Afghanistan, it's about 0.29, which means it's more equal But does that information alone make you want to pack your bags and move to Afghanistan tomorrow? No. And it's obvious why. On the other hand, Hong Kong has less income or more income inequality than we do. So they have about a 0.53 score, yet they are consistently in the top 10, even number 1 on the Economic Freedom of the World report. So it's a thriving, flourishing place. So income inequality can tell us some things, but it doesn't tell us everything. And so we have to understand that and really dig into the data before I think we kind of fly off the handle with policy recommendations. That's not to say we would never do anything. But so I want to tell a story of hope today. This is a graph, and I apologize, it's a little small probably for those in the back, but it's in the book. And the ideas are in the book. And that is world GDP from AD 0 to now. And it's literally a hockey stick. Most of human history has been one of fleeing predation and oppression, has been struggling to survive, not thriving. Only in the last 200 years has human creativity been unleashed in such magnificent and powerful ways that I don't have to worry about how to brush my teeth every morning. In fact, I don't even comparison shop for my toothbrushes. I just don't think about it. I go to the grocery store and buy it. That's a luxury that not everybody in the world right now has access to. And so as Christians thinking about flourishing and thinking about caring for the poor, what we really want to think about is how to make that graph continue to go upward across the globe. And the good news is, and Father Sirico says it this way, if you're living right now, you've won the historical lottery in terms of wealth. You are, and most my students don't believe me, but you as a student are of the richest people that have ever walked the planet. I realize you don't think you're rich, but you have a laptop. Napoleon commanded armies and he didn't have that, and he would have liked it. And so the question is, for the people who still remain in poverty, how do we unleash this idea of free exchange so that they can experience what we experience? And it's never been more possible than it is now. But as Christians, we have to know there's a right way to do that and a lot of wrong ways to get to that. And I think I need to wrap up soon. But I want to switch the debate a little bit from income inequality to this idea of income mobility, which we're doing a lot of data. If you're reading the news, this is all the rage right now, but also an idea of consumption equality. So if you think about what life was like in 1900, which is the middle of the Industrial Revolution, compared to, or the onset of it, compared to now, very drastically different. Life expectancy was about 51. Now it's 80. Children often worked at the age of 12. Electricity had just been invented, so most people didn't benefit from it. So life has really progressively increased for all people. And so my economist friend calls this the progressive cheapening of goods and services. That's what we want for the poor. What they don't have is access to goods and services and a lot of competing goods and services. So the woman right now who lives in Ghana, her life is about getting up every day with children in tow and walking to a dirty water source, carrying the water back in buckets, washing clothes. This takes a huge amount of calories just to get through every day. How do we allow her to unleash her creativity on the world? She too was made in the image of God. So that's what I want us to think about. And thinking about unleashing the potential for human creativity and entrepreneurship is our best bet to help the poor. Unfortunately, it's not easy. And so I just want to wrap up with this idea where I'm really concerned about the direction of this country is this idea of cronyism. I actually think that this is the biggest risk for income inequality and income mobility. Cronyism is the idea that large corporations or medium-sized corporations, any corporation that can afford it, can lobby for protection, for benefits, to block entry for new firms. Only the rich and powerful have enough excess capital to lobby in this way. So the grandmother who wants to sell pupusas and open up a food truck can't do that. She can't lobby on K Street. And so I think cronyism is a dangerous environment, and we have set a precedent in this country that politicians are willing to listen to people with cash. And I think this is where we have real concerns about the future of people's ability to maybe not stay poor, maybe start in the lowest income quintile like most of us did, but get out of it. And so that's where I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jay. My name is Peter, and when I was in college, I went to Messiah College, and I played soccer there. Any soccer players out here? Right. National team. When I got out on the field, I was a freshman, and I was on the junior varsity team. And I worked really hard, and then the coach saw me practicing, and he invited me up to varsity. Anyone remember that experience when you're invited up to the varsity team? And so I went to the varsity team, and our first game was against Gettysburg College. And crazy thing, we were down by 1, and he put me in. And my job was really simple. My job was to make sure that no one scored. He put me on defense, and that was the only thing he gave me. The other team scored, and I remember looking at my coach, and he just hung his head and shook his head. And the next day I was back on junior varsity. And I kind of felt like that when I got invited here, because this is like the varsity team. Come on, Art and Jay and all of you and Josh. And I just keep wondering, like, what's going to happen tomorrow? Am I going to see Josh, like, shaking his head, like, back to junior varsity, Peter? But what I want to do, I don't have a doctorate, I don't have a PowerPoint, but what I do want to do is I want to tell you 5 convictions that I have as I've thought about these issues, just 5 growing convictions. The first conviction is that in general, especially among college kids, when we start talking about stats and about economics and about theory and about finance, we lose the debate before we say anything else. That's conviction number 1. In general, the words that we use matter, and when we start from a cerebral economic foundation, we lose the ability to communicate with the next generation. Second conviction is I believe there's a wonderful way that we can actually start with the heart. When we start with the heart, we establish a much broader community. We engage people in a much broader community. And starting with the heart means when I drove here, there was a man sitting in the rain with a street sign that said, "Homeless, please help." And that hurts, thinking about someone that you know, someone that you care about that's on the street. That's not okay. Or my last trip to Haiti, when I got to sit down with moms and got to realize that to feed their kids, they were taking dirt and a little bit of flour and baking it in the sun so that their children would have something in their bellies so that they could go to bed not hungry. That's not okay in this world of plenty, that moms are sending their kids to bed after feeding them dirt. That's simply not okay. And I believe that that is a human connection. That changes the discussion. It changes the dialogue when we realize that in our heart we are moved with compassion when we see need. Just as Jesus looked out and he saw a crowd and he saw that they were hungry, he said, "We got to do something. Philip, Andrew, what are we going to do about this?" And in a similar way, we have the incredible privilege of connecting with individuals when we say, the world in the way that it currently works, there are incredible needs, and that hurts. That's not the way it was meant to be. But then that opens up the conversation to a third point. And the third point, which there is more and more experience and more data about, is the traditional way of helping actually causes long-term harm. I think about my own experience, again, going back to Haiti. And my first mission trip was when I was working at a school in Massachusetts. And I was privileged to take this group of 12 students out and to get this experience in Haiti. And as we were going and as we had all of this excitement, we got to pack our bags and we were given a list of people with needs. And so we packed our bags and we had our friends support us and we had a number of people give us things. And we were going to go and we were going to help make an impact on global poverty in a very personal and very tangible way. And so we showed up in this community. We worked in an orphanage and we had this opportunity to go into a community We showed up, we had the list of people that were in greatest need, and we had the privilege of opening up our bags of things that we had brought and got to give away things that were so generously given from a heart of compassion. But if you've been in experiences like that, you know what happened next. Complete pandemonium. It was chaos. The exact opposite happened. The more powerful ended up pushing down the weak, and it just caused a scene of chaos that left in the bags that were just strewn around on the ground. It left our motives and our heart absolutely broken, that this model, this what we thought we were going to do, actually, it just felt like it was a complete failure. It didn't work. When you have that experience, what you are open to realizing is that in the wake of our good intentions, oftentimes we leave a mess behind us. And Bob Lupton writes about this beautifully in his book, Toxic Charity, when he talks about when you show up in a community and you give that bag away, you give that gift for the first time, you elicit appreciation and gratitude. You go back to that same community a second time and you do the same thing and you create anticipation. You go up and show up a third time and you create expectation. You show up a fourth time and you create a sense of entitlement. And you show up a fifth time and you see full-blown dependency. In the wake of many of our good intentions, we leave people more dependent and more hopeless than they were when we ever arrived. And this is a fascinating study that supports this that was done by the World Bank. But the World Bank did a study of 60,000 individuals and asked them a simple question. It asked them to define what poverty is, because we've got to understand what it is if we're going to find a solution. And then when they asked a Western wealthy audience, the response was primarily, poverty is a lack of money and stuff. It was a material definition of poverty. When they asked that question to individuals living in poverty, the response was completely different. Individuals responded in much more sociological terms. They responded the feeling of voicelessness, of powerless. They sent a sense of shame, a sense of feeling dirty, a sense of feeling worthless, a sense of having an empty heart. Now here's the problem. If we just have a model of redistribution for someone that receives our charity, who already feels like they have no power to change their circumstance, that actually makes them feel more powerless. For someone that feels they have no voice, for someone to actually show up and give them stuff without even knowing their name, without even knowing their dreams, without even knowing what they want, that leads them feeling more voiceless. With someone who feels shame that they can't provide for their kids, when someone shows up and then takes care of their kids for them, bypassing mom and dad, that makes them feel more shame, more humiliation, more inferiority. And so we have more and more data that supports this, but on a very human level, every mom and dad knows that they don't want their kids to be someone else's charity case. And yet that continues to be the prevailing way that we try to respond to the needs that we see and the needs that we feel. So, number 4, when we look at this, I believe inevitably when we start with compassion, we inevitably end at a conclusion that a job is better than a handout. And I love this quote from Bono. Everyone, who doesn't love Bono? We need more Bono. But Bono recently said, "I'm a rock star preaching capitalism." Wow. Sometimes I hear myself and I just can't believe it. Commerce is real. Aid is just a stopgap. Commerce, entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid. And again, this is so beautifully demonstrated with so much wonderful data. But at its core level, we know a job is better than a handout. And so the question then is, how do we do that? How do we promote? And that's where there's this fantastic book, Money, Greed, and God. Have you guys heard of it? It's the most amazing book. And I'm like, the economics Bono is right here with us. But I love that because then it opens up the conversation of thinking about these issues. And the question is, how do we best unleash that potential that we see? And that's really been my job, my passion, traveling around the world, meeting individuals that at one time I would have only seen what they don't have. I would have saw their lack of shoes, their lack of clothes, their lack of material. I would have seen all of their lack. And yet today I believe that the world looks entirely different when you look through a lens that says every individual has gifts, every individual has abilities, every individual has that desire to create a better future for their kids. And the best way to see that happen is to move beyond traditional charity and to do everything possible to unleash the potential and power of that individual that will enable human flourishing. My last point, my last conviction, is that as good as that is, a job is not enough. And that's when I love what we're doing here. The intersection of faith and economics, the connection of the heart and the head. I love the group of people that are here today. And for me, my eyes were open to this when I was living in Rwanda, working in microfinance. And one of the first individuals I was able to help was a man who had a business, and the business took off. It was a gardening business, and we helped him get the tools that he needed. We helped him get the supplies that he needed. And here I am, a 23-year-old, super excited individual trying to change the world for Jesus. And this is the individual who became the poster child. Business was growing. I was establishing a relationship with him and ended up showing up at his home. And I remember being absolutely let down when nothing had actually changed in his home. His kids were still in bare feet. His home still had a dirt floor. Went back a little bit later, and no change again. And it was so baffling to me. It was so incredibly baffling to me that the promise of what I had been sold did not match the reality of what I was seeing. And turns out, he was prospering economically, but he was spending the increased money on alcohol, on prostitution, and on gambling. And I thought, that's not what I want to give my life to. His kids have no better future. The ability that we have to say, yes, we want to increase wealth. Yes, we want to do that. But we don't want to miss the opportunity to say there's more than life. There's a heart that we have as well. There's a soul that we have. And we don't want to be so consumed with the physical that we miss the opportunity to realize life is more than just the accumulation of what we have. And that's why it, again, is such a privilege to be part of this project, to be a part of this conversation, and to really celebrate the good work that really is happening around the world.
Peter, that was terrific. I wish you had gone last, and I'd have to follow after you. Unfortunately, I do. And my job in this book was actually the same. I was asked, and I think Ann and Art asked me, write the conclusion and sort of bundle everything up and summarize it that has been said in the previous 250 pages. And this is actually daunting. I spent actually a huge amount of time on this conclusion because there's so much in this book. And as you can tell from Art's description, we're essentially about really a complicated and sophisticated, I think, intellectual task of integrating the truths of theology, of a fully grounded biblical theology, and what we might call the sort of empirical discoveries and truths of economics. And so I just very quickly want to really talk about two things that I talk about in more detail in the conclusion. But the first question, if you're a Christian or a religious person that's also interested in this issue of poverty, the subtitle of the book is A Biblical Answer to Poverty. I'd ask, okay, what is our goal exactly? Both, what is our goal, what should we do, and what should we think? What's the intellectual task before us? And I think sort of abstractly, it's easy to describe, right? Obviously, what we're doing has something to do with economics. Is the best I could do, filthy lucre here, but that's a symbol of economics, right? And then theology and scripture. And what we want to do somehow is we want to integrate those things. So these aren't two non-overlapping magisteria, right? They're not sort of maybe two sources of knowledge that have nothing to do with each other. And the way I put it kind of abstractly is what we want to do is we want to integrate the descriptive truths and the theoretical insights of economics. Economics understood as a discipline and as a domain of reality with the normative principles of ethics and the relevant truths of theology. Now that's, it's one sentence, it's easy to describe, but I think the task is more complicated because it's not as if, okay, we're going to get our theology and our ethics from the Bible, and we're just going to get the economic stuff from the study of economics. And in fact, when you read the book, you'll see that the Bible is chock full of economic wisdom. I mean, the idea of private property, which almost all economists agree is one of the key conditions for wealth creation. I mean, 2 of the 10 commandments right? They presuppose something like the right to private property. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet implies that some people, at least sometimes, have a right to their possessions. The idea of human beings not as mere animals, not as mere consumers, but as the unique creatures made in the image of the creative God. That's a profound theological truth. I happen to think that's also a profound economic truth, and if you don't understand it, you'll tend to advocate economic policies that are not appropriate to the human person. But if you know that human beings, though fallen, are also created in the image of the creative God, then you're going to want policies that enable that allow human beings to exercise their creative ingenuity. And so what that means is that though we're talking about the normative truths of theology and Scripture, don't expect just to get theology from the Bible. You're also going to get some key economic insights. And that's one side of the claim. The other side, though, is that, of course, we're not going to learn everything from the biblical text. I'm pretty sure the Gini coefficient is not anywhere in the Bible. Maybe it's in the Deuterocanonical text or something, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure, this is obviously an intellectual development of the economic discipline. More basic things like the idea of comparative advantage, the idea of the price function, the subjective theory of economic value, the relationship between supply and demand. These are intellectual insights and they're discoveries. They're things that if you spend a little time on it, these are things that you know that most people in human history did not know. Just as there was a time in which people didn't understand algebra or even understand the concept of zero, we live in a time after that in which we, at least if we study a little bit, we actually have some insights that other people didn't have. And so what that means is there are certain things we have to learn that we're morally obligated to learn, I would argue as a Christian, from economics, if we actually want to have a full and robust answer to the question of poverty. The notion that Peter mentioned here at the end, I think, is absolutely important. If you just look at economics through a utilitarian lens and you think, okay, well, the only thing we should really be concerned about is that everybody have the right number of dollars in their bank account, or that each person have a job, you'll reduce the human person so that you don't understand that they have their very important moral and spiritual realities that are, in fact, the kind of governing realities from which certain economic goods come. And so that's why the task, I think, is complicated, this task of integration of theology and economics. The other thing is that most people, quite frankly, don't study economics, and as I've learned, having talked about this subject for years, aren't actually interested in economics, unfortunately. I blame the economist, incidentally, because I think the subject, it's about human beings at bottom. It's about human beings and the ways in which we interact and trade and compete and cooperate and trade goods and services and information. So at bottom, it's a very interesting thing, and it's something that I think most of us, reasonably intelligent people, can get a hold of. And so the claim is not that if we're going to have a responsible approach to poverty, a biblical approach to poverty, we're going to all have to have graduate degrees in economics. And in fact, I think most of the sort of important things that we need to learn from economics and that we take into a proper solution to poverty can be distilled into ordinary English language. I won't give you those. I won't give you the list of the things that I think are needed, at least culture-wide, for actual wealth creation and poverty alleviation. Those things are in the book. Instead, I'll just leave you with a metaphor, with a story that I think can help us reframe the way we think about the integration of economics and these important moral considerations. I've got a picture up here of some men. Some of you have probably heard of these guys. It's Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. If you're from New Zealand or have visited New Zealand, you know Hillary because he's on the money. He's on the currency in New Zealand. Well, Tenzing Norgay is a Sherpa from Nepal, and Sir Edmund Hillary were two men that were part of a British expedition in May of 1953. They're well known, and they're probably the best known mountain climbers in history for one specific reason. They were the first men to summit the top of the tallest mountain on the planet, Mount Everest, 29,028 feet. No one, so far as we know, had ever done it prior to them summiting the mountain on May the 29th of 1953. And so we remember that. And if those of you know a whole lot about mountain climbing, here's a rare picture on a clear day of Mount Everest. It's quite staggering. But what's especially staggering about Everest and K2 and many of the mountains in the Himalayas is that the bases themselves are very high. So Mount Rainier out by Seattle is about 14,500 feet high. The bases on many of these mountains are that high. And so this is why the Sherpas, the ethnic group that Tenzing Norgay is a part of, tend to be so great at mountain climbing because they live in the region. Some of them live in villages that are 10 or 11 or 12,000 feet above sea level. So they're very well adapted for mountain climbing. But what's interesting about the British expedition that Hillary and Norgay were a part of is that they also had access to information and to technology that people didn't have before. In fact, if you look at that picture up there, you notice they had oxygen tanks. Well, you don't have to necessarily have an oxygen tank, but it's actually really helpful when you get to the rarefied air at 29,000 feet up to have that. They had access to radios, so they're able to talk with others about the particular microclimates that tend to crop up in Mount Everest. They had access to data of other people that had tried and failed to get to the top. And as a result of that, they reached the top. It was snowing by the time they reached the top. So remember, they climbed to the top of Everest without the comfort of the footprints of previous mountain climbers. There was a point they reached in which no one else had reached before. And in fact, they didn't even have the comfort of their own footprints on the way down because of the snow. This is a sort of daunting enterprise, and this is a picture from about a decade later that the AP and the LA Times printed that showed the route they took, which is called the Southern Coal Route. The Northern Coal Route at the time, which was a candidate, had been closed by China, so this forced them to take this one route. You'll see the black line that goes from the base up to the top of Mount Everest. And you'll see these little triangles on this image, at least those of you in the front row. What those triangles are base camps. And those were base camps that were not there when Hillary and Norgay made their climb. These are base camps that have been laid along the known route from the base to the top over the years by other mountain climbers, thousands of mountain climbers that have followed exactly the same route to the top. Now you might think from here, it's like, okay, well, it's a nice sort of easy climb up, right? You know, it's a nice sort of grade. Well, there was one spot, and if you read a biography of Hillary, he was a very sort of humble man. He died a few years ago, but he describes this particular point in which he and Norgay reached. They had broken away and were separate from the rest of their expedition. They reached this point, which they had a sheer granite cliff and a glacier and a crevasse of the glacier inconveniently placed directly between the glacier and the cliff. Right? Now, needless to say, they didn't have these ropes already attached when they got there. And probably lesser climbers would have stopped right there. But if you read Hillary's account, he says, well, we were a little nervous, but I was able to wedge myself in and work our way up, and we were able to do it. Managed to make it. I mean, this is about all he says about this, right? I mean, my legs are sort of wobbling just looking at the picture. But I mean, imagine this. But because they made this climb, this might look like an impossibility, but every other climber that's climbed Everest has known that there's at least one well-known and traveled pathway up the mountain. That's why we celebrate them, because they were the first ones up there. And why do I tell you this story? I mean, other than it just being a kind of a nifty story, I think it's an important metaphor for us, especially for Christians that already presuppose that we have a moral duty to help those less fortunate, those domestically that are around us here in D.C. or wherever we live, and especially those in the undeveloped and the now developing world that still languish in absolute poverty. We take for granted that we have a moral obligation to do that, but to do something about it. But as Peter said, we often don't actually focus on the known pathway up the mountain. If you're an American or you are from or live in one of the developed countries of the world, you're like one of the climbers. Either Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay are one of the climbers that's taken the same pathway up the mountain. We know how this is done. We know how other cultures emerge from absolute poverty and create wealth for everyone in the society. But yet when we think about charity, and often when Christians who actually have their theology really straight start thinking about how to help the poor, we ignore the known pathway up the mountain of wealth creation and poverty alleviation. Instead, we say, let's try something else. I mean, let's try government-to-government foreign aid, or maybe we'll try charity that's sort of based on a redistribution of wealth, or something like that. Well, unfortunately, maybe there's some other unknown pathway up the mountain, but the truth of the matter is when these other ways are tried, they usually end in sort of cliffs or cul-de-sacs. They don't work. And so I think we have a moral obligation if what we really want to do is help those, especially in cultures that don't enjoy the prosperity we have, is to figure out and then to help them learn to take the same pathway up the mountain of wealth creation that we've all taken. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to all of you, and apparently Peter Greer is on the varsity team, because the first question from a student is primarily oriented toward him. So apparently, I don't know, maybe you're going to be elected captain by the end of this thing. Thank you all very much. Obviously, we have chapters of this book that are sort of rooted in theology. We have chapters in this book that are rooted in economics and written by senior-level economists, and we have chapters in the book that are practitioner-driven. But this question from Bryan College, senior there, asks, what's the most practical way to shift the perception of markets as exploitative to a view that associates free enterprise with voluntary exchanges that reward God-given talents and human potential with income? What have you found practically, particularly Peter Greer, is the most helpful way to shift worldwide views of free markets that associate it with exploitation?
Wow, that's a great question. I had a public conversation with Shane Claiborne 2 times. The first time was here, thanks to AEI, and more recently had a conversation about social justice at Messiah College. And at the end of it, it was a wonderful conversation, wonderful exchange, but at the end of it, there was one student who came up and said, really liked, Peter, what you had to say, but you're just too in love with capitalism. And I felt like I just completely failed, because I feel like the conversation, if we put a system above the person, then we have failed. I would love to say, Peter, you care about people, all people, and because of that, you care about the pathway that has been well worn out of poverty into prosperity and human flourishing, and this is the best system we've got. Not perfect, but it's the best system we've got. And I think it's so 2 things I would say. 1, keep the person that you're trying to, keep the story central of the person you're trying to help. And then the second thing is, don't pretend that the system is perfect. Because once you pretend the system is perfect, you open yourself up for all sorts of critique. So I like to compare it to the alternatives, not to some gold standard. It's a flawed system, and the cronyism that we see is undermining all sorts of what we care about. And so to just talk about the positive without saying it's a flawed system, but it's the best we got, I don't know. I'd love to hear other thoughts on that too.
I do think it's honestly a rhetorical problem, as you implied, rather than a logical problem. This is what's sort of difficult for those of us that are interested in these economic questions, is that it's interesting and it's compelling and it's persuasive, and it persuaded me when I was struggling with this in college and graduate school. But most people, that's not where they are. And in fact, if you immediately start talking about these things, you tend to do exactly the opposite of what you want to do. And so, at least in my own experience, I think establishing sort of the baseline, what we're actually talking about. We're talking about human persons and how best to help them. And the only question is, of the live alternatives, well, what is it that we should do? But if you haven't sort of first established that rapport, that conviction that you in fact care, every argument and every piece of evidence you cite, no matter how true and persuasive, ends up falling flat. It's a little bit frustrating, honestly, for, I'm a philosopher, and so I want to be able to, okay, premise 1, right? I just want everybody to sort of follow, but that's just not how it is. And it doesn't mean we manipulate people with artificial stories and emotions, but it means that we have to weave in our arguments and the evidence with a narrative structure that is true to our point, but also gets directly at the heart, which is what's ultimately sort of governing people's concerns about these things.
Maybe just one comment from a theological perspective. I'm not an economist, but more of a theologian. But I think that really the cultural mandate is crucial, that people are made in the image of God to be able to express their creativity, to be able to bring new things into existence, to be involved in innovation. We have a paper we have from Michael Novak, and he defines capitalism in terms of innovation and creativity. And the question is, what system or what approach leaves people with the most opportunity to be free to use their creativity and develop the creativity in the creation around them? I mean, that's the question. That's got to be right at the center. What most affirms human dignity and allows us to fulfill the cultural mandate?
Very quickly, I also think that capitalism is, for Christians, the means to a bigger end. It's not the end in and of itself. So what are we after? We're about pursuing the cultural mandate, getting to a state of greater and greater levels of flourishing. It's imperfect. But I think if we talk about the outcomes of capitalism and how they impact real people, we're going to move the ball down the field more than just saying capitalism is good, other things are bad. So.
Terrific. Well, there's obviously a lot of wisdom in the room. We have a lot of questions. House rules are pretty simple. Please state your protest statement in the form of a question. If there isn't a question, we're going to lean in. There are other ways to do that as well. You can tweet a question to Values and CAP, our Values and Capitalism handle. You can tweet a question to Faith Work Econ, the If We Twitter handle. You can tweet a question to me at Josh_good_. And over to you now for 30 minutes of robust discussion. Let's start right here.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. No protest question here. I would like to start off, though, by saying, and something that you both brought up, Mr. Peter, as well as Ann, that capitalism, the outcome of capitalism is income inequality. So I think most of us would admit that we have a capitalistic side, but yet we have an altruistic side. So oftentimes they're in conflict. And as you well know, Judge Judy Sheinberg's one of her favorite quotes is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. So can you give me an example, and this is the dark question side, is can you give me an example, and you started to, Peter, where you did something with good intentions, but then it turns out that the people that you were trying to help actually saw you as an adversary, beyond not appreciating what you did, but saw you as an adversary, and then that started to change your whole perception of whether or not you should engage in this game of being the kind person that you are with the real feelings that you have, versus when you did something and someone actually thanked you and became a better person as a result, and then came along later on to help you to do your job.
Is that to me?
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, candidly, the first number of instances that came up is, so I work in microfinance. We're in 17 countries and serving over 600,000 families with saving services, biblically based business coaching, as well as access to small loans. And I think about several stories, several instances where the person that we were trying to help was not able to repay their loan, or the entire, so it's based on the community banking model where if one individual doesn't repay the loan, then the rest of the members have agreed to repay for that individual. So it's a social guarantee, so it can work in the absence of property rights because you collateralize relationships, the social capital, in the absence of other forms of capital that you could borrow against. And I think about several stories, candidly, where the individual's business did not work, and we did pursue collection with the group. We mandated that the group repay for that individual. They knew what it was that they were signing up for, and yet in some circumstances that meant that their cost of capital, when you factored in what they had to repay with the other individual, was exceptionally expensive, and in some cases hurt the people that we were trying to help. And that hurts us as well. It hurts the mission, it hurts the model, but not every business is going to work, and when it doesn't, you feel, you don't feel it as much, but you feel some degree of the pain that family and that community have to go through.
Bruce, we got roaming mics. Let's get another question. This gentleman right here.
Thank you. Andrew Evans from National Affairs. Peter, I want to try to sharpen something that you seem to be dancing around in your comments. So capitalism helps to alleviate poverty by bolstering sort of the financial system and allowing people entrance into the market. So Dr. Lindsay, what you were saying with, sorry, Dr. Bradley, what you were saying with the interconnection of people working together, sort of division of labor, helps produce more wealth, and that helps alleviate poverty by alleviating the physical deprivation. There seems to be a sense in which poverty isn't simply material, that there is a lack of social capital, of weakness of communities, especially in this city. And it seems like, is there a sense, Peter, for you seem to be dancing around this potentially, but for the rest of you, is there a sense in which capitalism and the values that capitalism encourages, profit motive, for example, work against or in tension with notions of social capital and notions of a strong community? So is there a Christian critique of capitalism that forces Christian communities, like the church, to act not as sort of champions of capitalism, but as necessary ballasts against the excesses and vices of capitalism?
Just maybe a quick comment before Peter answers. We do have a book. Our next book is Critiques of Capitalism. So anyway.
Stay tuned.
I will comment after reading that book. No, I mean, just real quick. So all my work experience is international. So the application of these principles in a domestic setting, I'd be fascinated and I have thoughts on, but many other people could speak with far more experience on that. But internationally, what I love about the model of capitalism is it's actually a means of exchange between two people. It changes the power dynamics. There's someone who's giving and there's someone who's receiving, and yet both, if it's done well, think they both just got something amazing out of the deal. So it has the potential to strengthen that. And again, our model is based on the community guarantee that instead of fixed pie thinking, where if one person prospers, everyone else thinks that person took what is mine, you have a group that actually shows that they can start some pie-making businesses and everyone's eating more pie through that model. So the very way that it's set up, I believe, has the ability to strengthen the community. But we are flawed, very fundamentally flawed. And there always is a tendency to exploit. And that's part of my critique of capitalism, is it requires flawed people to be the primary agents that implement the system. And that's going to mean there are going to be flaws in the system. But overall, I do believe instead of categorically decreasing the relationships within a community, it fundamentally has the opportunity to strengthen as more people realize, I want to make shampoo, you want to make toothpaste, let's figure out how I do what I do, you do what you do, and we're both better off.
Just maybe a quick comment there, too. There's a book called Poverty of Nations by Wayne Grudem and Barry Asmus. And it has a whole chapter on virtues that both are necessary, about 35 different virtues that are necessary to undergird capitalism or business or markets. But also, he argues, and it's interesting, that capitalism, business, and markets produce or are conducive to those virtues. So that's a very interesting thesis. It works both ways. So something to consider. Anyway.
Next question. Nicole, I see one here.
Hi, I'm Cecilia Hubach. My question has to do with, so I know that there's sort of this common theme of, as we're trying to understand the framework in which we advocate for this system, understanding that capitalism is flawed, but it's the best system we've got. And so understanding that, yes, it can lead to corruption or exploitation or greed, but it doesn't have to, and that's not inherent to the system. I think those kinds of stances, I've heard several people say, like those exact words about government, understanding like, hey, it's a flawed system, but it's sort of the best we've got, and it doesn't have to lead to power and corruption and greed, but it does. So let's work within the system to try and make it better. So aside from sort of the stats or all of the data, what would be a theological response to say, maybe just, I don't agree that that's the best we have, or even though you can look at all of the evidence of the corruption on one side and the corruption on the other, like, why does, yeah, why do we have to accept one is better than the other?
Just to mention, I'll let Jay maybe speak about this in a minute, but I think that we have several papers on this issue of government from a biblical perspective. And I think one of the most interesting things that we've discovered that's very central is that in, say, Romans 13, which is a classic passage on the subject, the main purpose of government is to punish the evildoer and give praise to those who do good, not to necessarily be the one that does the good. Same thing in 1 Peter chapter 2, same thing in 1 Timothy 2. We've got many warnings throughout Scripture and many examples of government gone amok, like 1 Samuel 8, where there's a tremendous warning about the danger of government. That Samuel, prophet Samuel, talks about the government's tendency to take and take and take and take ever more. You also have power concentrated. And the idea is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's a tendency on the part of government, if it gets too large, to do that. In any case, those are just a few thoughts. Jay, you want to speak?
Yeah, I think it's really important to define terms. And in fact, I've changed my mind. I had a book in 2009, the subtitle had the word capitalism in it. And now I use the word if I know I'm not going to throw people off. Otherwise, I talk about free exchange or economic freedom or free enterprise. But the reality is that people are defending capitalism. You ask them what they mean something like private property, rule of law, economic freedom, the opportunities for free exchange. Those, I wouldn't say those are flawed. I think those are good things. It's just they always involve human beings who are themselves fallen. And so, you know, it's not as if capitalism defined in that way is intrinsically greedy. It's just that you get 2 or 3 gathered in a room and there's going to be greed because of the fall, you know. I wouldn't say, well, the government that we have or the, you know, particular situation we have is the best of the live alternatives. I would say that about free enterprise defined as I have defined it. I would not say that about government. I would say it's royally screwed up and we can do much better. I wouldn't say we shouldn't have government, so I may make some anarcho-capitalists mad, but I think, in fact, that rule of law is the most important precondition for widespread prosperity. It's just that probably the second precondition is limited government, because you need a government powerful enough to be able to reinforce and defend and protect the rule of law, but not so powerful that it becomes the greatest violator of the rule of law. And so you sort of work your way up from that. But I mean, I wouldn't even refer to the economy that we have in the United States as a free market economy. I think it's a more or less a cronyist economy that's still better than it could be. You know, it could be worse, but it's definitely not anywhere near the best live alternative.
Okay, Michael Grabowski with the Christian Post. I was curious, especially in light of your immediate comment there, for the panel, do you believe that at present there is a biblical answer to poverty? That model of thinking, is that widely practiced in the United States, in your opinion? And if it is not, how do you believe that anti-poverty efforts, private and public, would change if it were widely practiced?
I've talked a lot, so
Yeah, so my answer is that, if I understand your question, that I think right now we're not doing it right, for lack of a better way to put it. We're, interestingly, at the 50-year anniversary of the federally declared war on poverty. If you, and you know, I know people don't tend to like data, but I'm an economist, so it's hard not to go there. But if you look at the evidence, even if you just think about transfer payments, which is where we take money from some people via taxation and give it to other people, theoretically, this would be a way, right, a short-term way to help people. But the evidence gets to what Peter talked about with you creating a culture of entitlements where it's actually, perhaps to use the word luxurious, to benefit from those entitlements rather than to work. So we don't want to go that far. But the other huge problem is that if you look at overall transfer payments, which are in the billions of dollars, like 11% of them go to the poor. So most transfer payments in this country go to people who are well connected and wealthy. And so I would even say that, you know, we're not doing what we're saying we're going to do. So it's a very convoluted system. Now, to answer the second part of your question, do I think if we could roll back some of these, kind of the way we help the poor, because we know unequivocally we have to do that. And we change the paradigm to actually help unleash, the creativity of people, to embrace their dignity, to help them get skills so they can go work themselves. I think we could make a tremendous difference in the world and in the United States. So I think there's hope.
I would just commend to you also Marvin Lasky's chapter in this book, which I have read, and I think is useful on this question as well. Let's go right here to this gentleman. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks. A very quick question. Peter, you gave two, and for all the panel, but you gave two disappointing examples, one from Haiti and one from Rwanda. And I'm wondering if I could get the panel's comments on the role of institutions. I mean, it sounds to me like the best you could try to do in Rwanda or Haiti is going to be limited by the fact that there's no institutions there like we have in Western countries that can protect these principles on which the free markets act. So is that not frustrating? I mean, how does the Christian who's called to go in person to these countries to help out respond to that limit of the society that you're going to?
I'm filled with incredible hope, actually, and there is no place on earth that is a story of greater hope than Rwanda right now. 20 years ago, there was the Rwandan genocide that devastated the country, and we work in Rwanda and Burundi, and you can, in many ways, they're parallel stories, similarly to North Korea and South Korea. They're same story, same geography, similar people, similar language. There's so many similarities. And if you look at Rwanda today, I can't believe what Rwanda looked like when I was there in 1999. It's the most hopeful story, and part of it is because it's not perfect, and there are all sorts of challenges too, so you don't want to gloss over that. But you do want to say the Rwanda today is unrecognizable from the Rwanda that I arrived in 1999. And you look at what happened in curbing corruption, you look at what happened in establishing property rights, and you look at all of the ingredients that are necessary. The end result of that is incredible prosperity. The growth rate has been one of the highest in the world consistently over the last 10 years. So I see that's a story. You get the other pieces in place, and then the small investments that we're making, the $200, $400 loans, you get to see grassroots entrepreneurs do amazing things. And again, just one quick story. I was there last summer and met a woman who was 80-year-old. She was blind, she was a widow, and she almost ticked all of the boxes of what would be a charity case, of what you would think we're just supposed to respond in charity. And yet this was not a woman who had her head down and her hand up. This was a woman who stood really tall, and she said, my kids are not going to see me beg, and I am going to provide for them. And she was in real estate. She had built onto her home, she was renting out rooms, and certainly having rule of law, having a semblance that if she makes this investment, it's going to be protected. But at the end of the day, it was her hard work, it was her ingenuity, and it was a system that matched capital with her willingness to work hard that enabled her whole family to have a different future. So I am not disappointed. And even in Haiti and some of the other places that we work, there are stories that don't get told enough of hardworking, faithful men and women who are changing their world. And it's really hard when you don't have the other pieces in place, but it still fills you with hope when you realize that small steps and small progress is happening, and it is happening consistently.
Example from Rwanda is the perfect setup for our next question, which is in the back, which comes from Father Antoine Radosari, who's here with us from Rwanda. Father Radosari is a senior cleric. Pleasure to have you today, sir.
Thank you. Actually, I will start with a comment, and thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was just passing by, and then somebody told me that there is this good conversation. But looking at this book and the good articles that are there, I just have 2 points before I ask my question. If you look at at the poorest countries, actually one of the biggest problems that doesn't get addressed, we keep talking of capital, we keep talking of money, but if you look at it, the greatest problem is the Human Development Index, which is quite low. And then when you look at poverty and you start looking at it from a systemic perspective, as a matter of fact, I was reading the chapter by Peter. You see it. You see poverty is not just a matter of not having resources. And addressing poverty will really not just be about pouring in money, but empowering the institutions, as the question was, and then empowering the individuals. And the question is, very often, you read the books about theology and others, you find that we are not empowering the churches, who are really the centers of distribution. Because if you look at the Human Development Index in the churches, let me take the case of the Anglican Church where I serve. 95% of the clergy are primary school level educated, which means that they are just at the low level in the community. And it's the same with other churches too. And that's an institution which is on a daily basis a distribution center. They are the ones who are training the people. They are the ones who are teaching them. And sometimes you wonder why things are not changing. My last point, and that's the question I come to, very often I've gone to conferences like this one, they say, oh, actually, aid hurts. Conclusion, no aid. Most of the people I meet, I tell them, actually, we are doing this. No handout. Because when we give handouts, when we give money, it hurts. So how are we going to link aid where it should be going? And that's the question I want to address to anybody on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter, I think.
I'll hit the first one. You guys hit the second. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful point. And if we have a conversation around faith and work and do not specifically address the church, then we have missed the bride in the wedding. And so thank you for that. I remember seeing data from the Western province in Rwanda that looked at the prevalence of hospitals, health clinics, and churches, and overlaying those. And guess what? 3 hospitals, maybe 100 clinics, and hundreds of churches. There is no better distribution model. There is no more expansive network than the local church. And we forget that to the detriment of all of these causes that we care about. Beyond that, the church is the one entity that has the ability to speak to hard issues beyond just the economics. And again, as the example from Rwanda that I gave, if there's no heart change, we're empowering, as has been said, today's oppressed to become tomorrow's oppressors. And we're not able to see lasting change. And so the key role, and it's been a great privilege, our savings program is all based in the local church. The Anglican Church has been a fantastic partner with it. Archbishop Raj is coming to Lancaster next month, going to have time with him, but it's been a wonderful partnership. And what we've done is we've empowered the local church to actually train these small groups where individuals save together and then they end up investing in each other's business. So it's the most grassroots form of capital mobilization, of investment, of starting to save and then invest in each other's. And the Anglican Church in Rwanda, as well as many other denominations, has been the key partner that has allowed us to scale. And again, there's no banner of Hope International. We see this as a way of supporting the local church as it does its ministry to the poor that, interestingly, actually has an economic focus to it.
I would add that what we're advocating here too is a framework for thinking about how to help unique individuals. And if we're trying to help unique individuals, then we need to first and foremost get into relationship and figure out what people need and how we can and how we can't help. And so those are real questions. And I think in the world we live in, and I'm guilty of this too, it's we want to be told what to do, and go A, B, C, D, do that, and you're going to have this great result. It's clearly not that easy. We know, as you kind of alluded to in your question, we know that we have to help. I think the disagreement among Christians is the how. But clearly, just because we have been perhaps doing it wrong doesn't mean we shouldn't do it at all. But it also means that as good stewards, we can't just, what I say, I kind of say, we just can't throw policy prescriptions against the wall and see which one sticks. Because there's a lot of collateral damage, and and a huge opportunity cost to doing so. We actually have to, and that's what Jesus, his model was, get into a relationship, know the people you want to help. It's not, right, pay your taxes and you're done caring for the world's poor. So I think we've gotten lazy about it. I think what we're prescribing is hard. I think we're going to have to roll our sleeves up, and I think we're going to have to realize there's not one size fits all for individual institutions across countries that are going to generate this opportunity society that we think is important.
Just one more comment. There's a great chapter there, Glenn Sunshine, the first main chapter. He talks about the importance of subsidiarity, of that people that are closest and have relationships with people that are poor. And it's not an impersonal thing, and they can adapt the solutions to the people that are there rather than impersonal and at a distance, so you don't know the situation.
So on your way out, don't forget to pick up, if you haven't already, a copy of this book, courtesy of IFWE. Lots more to chew on. We obviously need a system that not only works while we're with people, serving people abroad, but a system that works while we are sleeping at night. We obviously need to confront the trend, and even this current chapter, the last 5 years, we've seen the income inequality Gini coefficient move a 100th of a point. That is a 1 percentage point in the other direction, even though we've been investing this way. And so this book gives a lot to chew on, and I hope that you will continue to join the conversation at valuesandcapitalism.com, at tifwe.org, and with a number of us via Twitter. Thank you so much for coming. Good afternoon.
Hey.